Valley Event Center. We had, I handed out over 300 breakfast bags to people who've been waiting all night. And they're now getting served, so we'll remember them today. Some of the people who would be helping here today are over there, so we're a little bit shorthanded today. So please, if something is missing, just deal with one of us who are here. We'll try to help you the very best we can. So with that, Pastor Dave Moore from Tucson is going to pray for us, and then Dr. Nedley will be making his presentation. And we're looking for a wonderful time here together in the Lord. Pastor Dave, thank you.
Shall we bow our heads? Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful for your sacrificial love that we've experienced at every point in our journey. Some of us it has been very young, but perhaps some it hasn't been until our senior years. But we're grateful that you're deeply committed to us at whatever point we are in our journey, and you will never abandon us. We're grateful for the cross and your pledge of your love to complete the process of bringing us healing in our hearts. We pray that you'll bless Dr. Nedley as he guides us in this journey, for we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Dementia has been rapidly on the rise in the United States and throughout the world. Over 5 million Americans have it as we are sitting here this morning. 15 million will have it by 2050. 3 times as many. It's now the 6th leading cause of death in America, more deaths than breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. And we know how big those cancer deaths are. Breast cancer is the leading or second leading cause of death in women. Depending on how you look at it, it may be the top leading cause of cancer death. And then prostate cancer is number 2 in men. But lung cancer is, if you add up all the lung cancer, that's number 1 there. But Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death, and more than those 2 combined. In America, 1 person every 60 seconds is newly diagnosed with the disease. So just going through this presentation, there's 60 more people that have been newly diagnosed with dementia as the time has elapsed here. 1 out of 3 deaths, if you're fortunate enough to make it to your senior years, 1 out of 3 chance that your death is actually going to be not due to a physical problem, but to a problem with your brain. And 1 out of 3 deaths is currently from dementia. 16 million Americans provide unpaid care for people with dementia. So when you consider the 5 million Americans that have it, there's a lot of family members who are taking care of these individuals at home, and it's affecting a lot of lives. And then often it gets to the point where it's so severe that they can't have the resources and can't really take care of them, and then they have to be put into a nursing home or a memory care center. $278 billion was spent on this disease last year alone. $278 billion. That's a figure that's really hard to be able to grasp. But you can imagine how it is sapping a lot of resources, including the country's resources. 1 out of 8 people over the age of 65 have dementia. And I would imagine it's not necessarily that high in this group of those of you who are over 65, because many of those with dementia would be here if they didn't have dementia, and they're not able to come or really able to process the lecture and be able to actually learn from it. You know, one of the things that we have to be able to do to learn is to be able to retain. You know, our intelligence is our ability to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. And what a sad state that we're in when our memories prevent us from being able to retain that, and thus we can't apply it either. But if you're fortunate to live to age 85, 50% chance you'll have dementia. So rapidly accelerates from 65 to 85. In this country, unfortunately, I have found that many people consider dementia as a normal part of aging. It should not be considered as normal. And dementia not only includes memory loss, but changes in personality can develop with time as well. And behavioral changes will develop. Psychosocial changes can develop, increase irritability and issues such as that. And then eventually loss of ability to retain urine and stool also occur. And anger and even frequent cursing can occur. We've had individuals who really haven't cursed their entire life, and then when they get dementia, it just flows out of their mouths whenever their frustration happens. Worldwide, it's also a problem. 47 million people currently are living with it worldwide. 82 million by 2030, will more than triple by 2050 to 152 million. But notice, although the U.S. is less than 10% of the population, it's going to have 1 out of 3 of those dementia cases because it was 50 million by 2050. And in the world, a new case is diagnosed every 3 seconds. 818 billion spent per year worldwide. And 2 years ago, the World Health Organization published goals for dementia, now that it's getting out of control. And one of their top goals was diagnosing cases how? Early. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Optimize physical health, cognition, activity, and well-being. Detect and treat behavioral and psychological symptoms, and provide information and long-term support to caregivers. So those were the 4 goals that they had in attempting to accomplish. Regarding early diagnosis, doctors often use a mental status exam, but this does not test for early dementia. That tests for late dementia. By the time you start doing poorly on this exam, your dementia is far out of control. And so this is not early detection, and so this is why we have to come up with other instruments to be able to detect this early. And one of those early detection tests is called an MCI memory test. This is the memory test we utilize in our clinic. And it has to be administered by someone who's trained to administer it. It takes about 20 minutes to administer. It doesn't have to be the doctor. In fact, it's usually best not to be the doctor, but maybe a trained nurse or a trained technician to administer this test. And then we can start picking it up far earlier. There are individuals who cover their dementia pretty well. And if they're not around, I'll get away from this mic, I assume it's feedback here, but if they'll get around it by assuming that, and they kind of just fudge some in regards to their language and in regards to what just happened and those type of things. And they're pretty good at covering it up, and unless you're around them all the time, you wouldn't necessarily be able to pick up on it. And many people over the age of 65, they're retired, they're not really around a large group of people, and they can get by with not even necessarily knowing themselves that they have dementia. So in regards to memory, working memory resides in the frontal lobe of your brain and lasts less than a minute. So when you're trying to learn something or memorize something, in order to be able to put that long term, we have to be able to hold it there in the frontal lobe of the brain and we have to focus and concentrate enough in it that it actually becomes part of the permanent memory. And it is amazing how well this working memory can work if we also give it some practice. And practice can take place in several ways. You know, one of my early dementia patients, once we caught it and did some of the things that we're going to be talking about here today, I've had him work on memorizing license plates numbers when he's driving down the highway. And you know, it's something that can be done, and there's patterns and things, and he's actually gotten very good at it. And as a result, we've arrested the decline in his dementia as a result. Another thing he'll do sometimes is just take a deck of cards and look at them and then put them all face down and then have someone touch a card, and then he has to say what it is in regards to that memory. These are ways of working on your working memory aspect of things. But as I mentioned the other day, we're far better able to have this working memory working for us when we associate it with two things and not just one. And that's what he's been able to learn to do in regards to the license plates aspect of things, is that association. It's also very easy to be able to remember three things as opposed to four or more, and so the license plates number, of course, is more than just three things, but he groups them together. So, you know, there may be letters and then numbers, and he'll group the letters together and then the number together. Normally it's, 584 or something, so you can learn 584 much better than looking at the 5, 8, and 4 individually. And it's those type of things that can help them and help individuals in regards to their working memory. But this working memory, this form of memory, is commonly referred to as your attention span. Working memory lasts up to 1 minute before being erased. And so if we don't have the focus and attention, it's going to be gone. Short-term memory resides in the temporal lobe of the brain. The working memory is in the front part, but the memory, when it goes past that working memory part, it's actually stored in the temporal lobe, and that's behind the ear. That's the memory center of the brain, and lasts between a few minutes and a few weeks. An area on the inside or medial part of the temporal lobe called the hippocampus activates the brain areas that represent the memory so that the individual may retrieve it. And so it's one thing to have the memory there, it's another to be able to actually retrieve it. Not all of one's moment-to-moment experiences activate hippocampal short-term memory. Only those experiences that are novel, notice that part of things as well. If it's new and interesting, you're more likely to retain it. Or those one intended to remember, where you're actually working on remembering it, like this man was working on remembering license plates. By the way, he got so good, I was actually traveling with him with a group of students. We were going on TCI. I was actually bringing him with me so he could tell his experience to the homeless shelter that we minister to every week. And so I had a group of Weimar pre-med students with me, and I tested his ability to memorize the license plates versus theirs. And even though he had early dementia, he did better than they did. And that's because he had worked on it and he had really helped develop this portion of the brain. So they were pretty amazed at this. Once stimulated, these cells send electrical impulses to the hippocampus to activate short-term memory and retrieve the experience. And long-term memory lasts how long? A lifetime. This is stored in the brain, but you can have difficulty in retrieving it. One of the examples of this long-term memory, a lot of people don't know. I don't like to reveal this because I'm not necessarily very accomplished, But I did learn to play the piano from age 9 to 11. I was the 5th child, and I'm the least accomplished musically in my family. I think my parents were kind of tired by the time number 5 came about, and our music piano teacher moved away at age 11. And I ended up playing baseball and sports and took that opportunity to not remind my parents that I wasn't getting lessons. But, you know, at age 15, I had a desire, you know, to maybe get back to it some. And so they actually had to drive me to a place. The other place was just 4 doors down the street, so they didn't have to drive me any there before. And so I learned how to play some, you know, pieces, Moonlight Sonata and Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor and some of those pieces, and learned how to play some hymns and some Bach things and things like that. And actually memorize these pieces as well. And sometimes it'll be, you know, the other day I was sitting down, it had probably been 15 or 20 years before I had played any of these pieces. And as I'm sitting down to play, I can remember about the first 3 measures, and then it's gone. But then I would go back and play it again, and then a couple more measures would come to me. What was happening is the circulation to that area of the brain, as it was being stimulated, continued to do more. And so every time I played it, I could play more and more of the piece, and pretty soon, in one sit down, I was now able to play the entire piece from memory without ever getting the music out. And so this is how that long-term memory, it's there. It's a matter of being able to retrieve it and activate those areas. And so you have to keep kind of activating that until it actually occurs. Once mild cognitive impairment is diagnosed, however, it's time to begin an individualized workup and a personalized treatment plan for arresting the progression of the disease, and then working on a memory improvement plan. Now, we talked about intelligence, the ability to learn, retain, and apply knowledge, but as you age, use it or not? Okay, I'll use it. It wasn't working there for a minute. Okay, so I wanted to make sure this was the microphone that's working. But as you age, I don't know if some of you have noticed this, but physically you will slow down. There are less mitochondria in the muscles, there's less energy producing cells, and that slowness will occur in everybody eventually as they age. Now, there's a way of being able to put it off for a while, and that is particularly by continuing physical exercise. And as you continue to exercise, one thing you'll notice as you get older, when you were younger and you start exercising, you notice you keep getting better and better, and you accelerate very quickly. But when you're older, when you exercise, you don't really get better, you're just hopefully able to maintain where you were at before. And this is the aspects of aging in relationship to mitochondria. And so your strength does wane. There's a reason why there's no professional sports heroes, you know, after age 50. You know, their minds are still working great, but they've already started to decline enough where they can't necessarily compete in the competitive sports world. And it does take more effort just to retain your strength as you age. But interestingly, the brain is not prone to this aging naturally. The mitochondria cells do not go down in the brain. There's no natural aging processes that should make our brain less effective than what it was before if the brain is able to stay healthy. And so if you were very bright when you're young, you'll be very bright when you're old. But the problem is it's easy to get to memory loss. And sometimes to make it, this is based on a number of studies, but I'm just going to show you how your brain, and particularly if you have more than one of these factors, your brain will deteriorate. It's not designed to deteriorate with aging, it doesn't occur on the physical aspect, but we have to have these things in place. So how would we be able to get into memory loss quicker and more easily when we age? Studies show become a high school dropout. In other words, if you're wanting your brain to deteriorate quickly, quit learning at an early age. And this learning that we do at a younger age actually is going to help us later on. Also, don't graduate from college. That learning in college that takes place actually helps to store our brain and to help it be more resilient afterwards. And there's been a lot of Alzheimer's studies done on this. People with college degrees have less development of dementia later on in life than people that don't have college degrees. Now, you could get by without having a college degree and still be at low risk of dementia if you are learning similarly to how a college student would learn. And that's one of the advantages of taking, courses and taking, expanding your knowledge. And one of the advantages of being a Christian is we encourage everyone to have a daily devotional life where they're learning new things and they're applying this in their life. It actually can help prevent the onset of dementia later on. Another way to get into memory loss is become a couch potato. It's very clear if you are not active physically, dementia takes place far easier. Then this has also been studied. If you watch a lot of TV, you're going to have earlier onset of dementia, and it's going to be more profound. And if also you are playing with your devices. And particularly, you can even accelerate it further if you watch TV while you're playing with your devices. And we talked about devices the other day, and I didn't go into all of those studies. That's why some of you might want to pick up the memory stick presentation where we included a lot more of the science beyond that. But as we are multitasking in two dimensions, which is watching TV, texting, doing other things where we're doing Snapchat and those type of things, it does actually decrease this area of our frontal lobe where our working memory can have that focus. And so we start losing that focus as far as the frontal lobe is concerned. Constantly chat or text, look up things online, check your email almost constantly, and or do either YouTube or pornography or both. Studies show that these YouTube users, they get into digital dementia when they're going in from one YouTube to another. That's that working memory part of things. And pornography also adversely affects your focus in this area of the frontal lobe. And if you're doing both of them, it's even worse. Don't physically exercise and don't try to get fit. Just stay unfit. That will accelerate dementia. This has also been studied. The more frequently you have sex, or if you're masturbating, or if you're having trouble climaxing, going into superstimulatory sex, this is going to have a role and a toll to play on this working memory of the frontal lobe. We talked about hypofrontality that occurs. This is the concentration aspect of things. And sodomy, I didn't go into all the definitions, but I will go into the definition of one of the aspects of sodomy that's often not talked about, but it is superstimulatory sex, and that is if you're climaxing utilizing oral sex. That is not by design, and that is actually the superstimulatory portion, and it is going to have its toll to play. And of course, it leads to the addiction and then not being able to do it in the designed fashion. Don't try to memorize anything. If you need to know something, just Google it. So don't work that memory. You know, you've got that phone there, it's stocked with all sorts of things. Don't try to associate it. If you need to learn something, just look it up, but then you'll forget it very quickly. I've seen people do this. You know, 10 minutes later, after they looked up some statistic that they needed to know, you'll ask them about it again, and they'll have to look it up again. They don't have it there. Eat lots of sugar. That will also cause a accelerating aspect of dementia. Now, sugar, this has been studied out. If you drink a sugary drink versus water, you will actually have 14 times the amount of free radicals in your brain that are actually causing problems as far as brain function is concerned. Eat high cholesterol and food with lots of saturated fat. We'll get into that in a little bit, but the higher your cholesterol level, the more you're going to get dementia. And this will be a very common form. It's just as common as Alzheimer's dementia. It's called vascular dementia, and it's due to not having the circulation up there in the brain. Become overweight and even obese. This is also associated with development of dementia. Eat lots of salt. How this is connected is particularly through blood pressure. The higher your blood pressure is, the more your brain is going to have dementia problems. And it'll get into early dementia in virtually everybody that has high blood pressure that's not controlled. High blood pressure and dementia go hand in hand, and that's why one of the first things I do with somebody who is having early onset dementia is to take their cholesterol level and to take their blood pressure. And we're going to do whatever we can to get those things under control, because that will prevent the acceleration of the disease many times. Try to develop high blood pressure, diabetes, and/or depression and anxiety. Depression accelerates dementia significantly. In fact, it's one of the highest risk factors. If you've had dementia in your 20s or 30s, you are over 3 times as likely to develop dementia by the time you're in your 60s. And so this is why it's important for us to treat the underlying cause of depression, because that will also help that person's memory a long time afterwards. And then smoke tobacco, marijuana, or drink alcohol. Any of those 3 or all combined are going to accelerate dementia. So those are the 14 easy steps to dementia, and we want, of course, to avoid those 14 easy steps, and that's the purpose of me writing those down. There are non-modifiable risk factors. What I've just mentioned are the modifiable risk factors for dementia, but there are non-modifiable risk factors that we can't necessarily do anything about. Of course, I mentioned age. The older we get, the greater the likelihood. But another risk factor that a lot of people are not aware of is the female gender. Females have a greater likelihood of experiencing dementia than males. And it's a 2-to-1 ratio. So females live longer than males, but their memory loss is twice as likely to occur than it is in a male. And so it's very important for females also to pay attention to these 14 areas. So when I have someone with early dementia, nothing compares to a good history and physical and a serum workup. See a good doctor who can help you with this, and get them to take a good history and physical and do some blood work. Make sure that blood pressure is looked at. Pay close attention to it. Where should your blood pressure be? Less than 120/80 is the ideal blood pressure for avoiding dementia. Get blood work, CBC, CMP, magnesium, thyroid testing. Sometimes it's the thyroid. And then look for inflammation. C-reactive protein and sed rate are inflammatory markers, and the dementia might be due to inflammation in the brain. Get those lipids like I talked about. Get vitamin D levels. Low vitamin D can also accelerate dementia. Get B12 levels. This is something we see common. 20% of people with dementia have a contributing factor of not enough B12 in their system. And that's even among the meat eaters. People think B12 is just a problem with vegetarians. Not true. 99% of people with B12 deficiency are meat eaters. Folate levels are also important in memory, and so we like to see those folate levels above 15. B12 levels we like to see above 500. Homocysteine levels, we like to see those less than 10. High homocysteine can also help accelerate it. And then there's something called a whole blood histamine, which helps us with methylation. And either too high a methylation or too low a methylation can produce some cognitive issues as far as memory. So these are standard workup things that I do to leave no stone unturned so that we can reverse this acceleration. What are some things that can help everybody? One of them are polyphenols, which are anthocyanins. And these are foods that have the blue-purple pigment. It's kind of interesting. There have been some studies done, autopsy studies. Yesterday I talked about autopsy studies in children and infants. But this is autopsy studies in adults where they may have an accident or things like that, and then they're taken to autopsy and the pathologist is looking at the brain and things of that nature. And if they have had anthocyanins to eat within 3 hours of that accident, when they open up the brain and look in the brain, they will see that blue-purple pigment in the hippocampus area of the brain where memory is centered. So there's a predilection to have these anthocyanins go into the memory sections of the brain, which are actually protecting our brain and enhancing it further. Now, they didn't die because they ate those anthocyanins. It was unrelated to the cause of death, but it was one of those things that's been described in the scientific literature. It's amazing where we see that pigment taken up by the brain itself. And so these pigments actually cross the blood-brain barrier, and they go to learning and memory centers in the brain. Blueberry supplementation, that's what the medical terms for it are. Blueberry supplementation improves memory in older human adults. Then there was this study by the British Journal of Nutrition, which took a look at another food that has anthocyanins called Concord grapes. And Concord grapes have been shown to improve verbal learning. And they did a nice study looking at grape juice versus placebo. What do you think they used for placebo? It's always nice when we can do a placebo from a natural substance. No, their placebo was not water. It had to have the taste of grapes where you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. It was grape Kool-Aid. Which doesn't have any anthocyanins in it. And so that was the placebo, and you couldn't really tell the difference by tasting if you were getting grape juice or the grape Kool-Aid. But they did see a significant difference in regards to the results. Significant benefit with grape juice in all of those areas compared to grape Kool-Aid mix to match the taste. Increased neural activation in cortical regions. This study from Harvard showed that blueberries and strawberries improve memory and decrease cognitive decline in older women. This was a study of over 100,000 nurses, and it actually declined it by 2.5 years as far as getting into dementia. So that's significant to be able to go another 2.5 years without it. But then the question was asked, how much did you have to eat in order to decline or arrest this dementia by 2.5 years? And the answer was 1 serving a week of blueberries, so it's not a lot, or 2 servings a week of strawberries, also not a lot. But the question is, what would have happened had they had more than that? And we don't know that, but it could have been even better if you were eating it on a regular basis. Some of the things that I was raised with, which you didn't really have opportunity to appreciate. I was raised in the Detroit, Michigan area, and up north of Detroit, there's a lot of blueberries that are grown in the rural areas. It's kind of swampland, a lot of lakes there in Detroit, and the blueberries grow abundantly in these swamps and big giant bushes, that are taller than you are. And every August and September, my dad would take the family out there in a you-pick blueberry farm, and we would pick blueberries. And I remember thinking, my dad's an engineer, he makes enough money, we could just buy these in the store. Why are we going out and picking all this? But you know, my dad enjoyed them so much, we would kind of joke because it seemed like one went in his bucket and one went in his mouth. And, you know, and then we'd come home later on in the day with all of these buckets, and then we would freeze these blueberries. And as a result, we had blueberries through the entire winter, and they'd last until the next year with 5 kids and 2 adults picking all these blueberries for a day. But now I'm trying to look for opportunities. I was up there in Washington. I realized they had blueberry farms. I said, please call me when your blueberries are ready. I'll fly my little Bonanza up there, and we'll take our family and pick these things fresh. But when they were fresh, I was having to go overseas somewhere, and so I missed that opportunity. But it's something that I'm sure has helped me with those blueberries at a young age. Resveratrol is one of those pigments that is present in blueberries, but also present in grapes. And it's been shown to improve neurogenesis and expression of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, mRNA, in the hippocampus. That's called BDNF. And BDNF is one of the things that works as a brain fertilizer to prevent our brain going into dementia. Resveratrol increases BDNF levels. Now let's take a look at the foods that have resveratrol. Bilberries, 768 nanograms per gram. Cranberries, higher yet. Blueberries, almost double of cranberries. Peanuts actually have a lot of resveratrol, one of the advantages of peanuts. Red grapes have even more. The Pinot Noir red grape in particular. Ligonberries even higher yet. And then the Merlot red grapes are at the highest. This study took a look at risk factors for Alzheimer's, and it found out diabetes was a risk factor, obesity a risk factor, high blood pressure a risk factor, smoking a risk factor, depression a risk factor, physical inactivity. And when it looked at those 6 areas, it then looked at what if these were actually eliminated in this group of people that we're studying. And they found out that if we could eliminate those 6 things, we would save 500,000 cases of Alzheimer's per year. That's significant. 500,000 cases related to these 6 things. And so it's very important for us to also stay lean as we age as well, and also make sure that that diabetes gene, if we have it, is not active, and that we stay physically active. Saturated fat in the diet has also been found to be an additional risk factor, and those on a high saturated fat diet, it's equivalent to about 6 years of brain aging. And that's significant. So we slowed it down by 2.5 years by blueberries, but you can get rid of all that effect just by eating a diet high in saturated fat. 65% greater odds of worse global and verbal memory on those on a high saturated fat diet. Now, Ansel Keys was the father of cholesterol research, and he said your cholesterol is equal to 1.26 times 2 delta S minus delta P plus 1.5 times the square root of C. And what he was able to determine was what your cholesterol would be based on what you were eating in those 3 things. And notice the S, the saturated fat, has a 2 in front of that, which is a 1.26 in front of that. And so when we eat saturated fat, even though it doesn't have cholesterol in it, it will dramatically increase our blood cholesterol levels. The P is going to have a minus in front of it, but the P won't minus it as much as the S drives it up. In fact, to bring your cholesterol down, you would want to have it more than twice as much P in relationship to S. Now, if I were to have a vat of saturated fat on this side of the podium and another vat of polyunsaturated fat on this side of the podium, how would you be able to tell the difference by looking? It wouldn't be the color. It would be the consistency, yes. One would be liquid, the other one would be solid. Which one would be solid at room temperature? the saturated fat. So the more saturated fat, the more solid the fat, and the more it's going to cause problems. So let's take a look at the P-to-S ratio of food. In order to have a really good food in regards to this, we want to have twice as much P in relationship to S. But notice beef and lunch meats, 0.09. Is that less than 2 or greater than 2? That's less than 2. It's far less than 2. And that means it's going to dramatically increase our blood cholesterol levels. Cheese, not any better, 0.09. Going to dramatically increase. It's loaded with saturated fat, as is milk that has fat in it. Butter, of course, 0.11. Very low P-to-S ratios. Bacon, deer, and lamb, slightly better. This is why the world advocates chicken and turkey, because its P-to-S ratio is a little better. But is this less than 2 or greater than 2? It's still less, it's even less than 1. It's still going to significantly raise our cholesterol levels. So this is why switching over, I remember one patient I had, actually wasn't my patient, he was, this was back in the Oklahoma days when we would do screening tests on anyone who would show up in the community. They'd pay a small fee and we'd do all these blood tests, and then they would come pick up their blood test results, and we would normally have an explanation of the blood test results, but this was a businessman who couldn't spend any time with us. He just wanted to get his labs and go away. But I remember after 3 times of him coming back, he wanted to stop and just consult with me before the lecture. He said, I don't have time to stay from the lecture, but Dr. Nedley, here's my cholesterol. First time I came here, 280. Second time, 270. Now, 267. He says, Dr. Nedley, I'm eating all the chicken and turkey I can stand, and it's not making that much difference. Well, you know, it's not going to make that much difference until we actually change the diet dramatically to get the P-to-S ratio greater than 2. I said it'll be well worth your time if you stay for this lecture and come to our upcoming nutrition seminar, which he did, and then he was able to make a big difference. Fish, this is why the world recommends fish, 1.8. It's better as far as P-to-S ratio, but it's still less than 2, and this is why cholesterol levels invariably go up in vegetarians who eat fish. But it's not just animal foods. Notice this, coconut oil. Is that less than 1 or greater than 1? It's far less than 1. Coconut is very saturated, and it does increase your cholesterol levels. One of the biggest crazes that there's gone on in this country, and it's been a big deception, is that if you have memory loss, pour coconut oil on everything. There is no shortage of saturated fat in people's diets in America. We don't need more saturated fat. That's going to accelerate the decline. Now, I would be okay spreading a little bit of coconut strips on something or whatever, because it takes, you know, several coconuts to produce a tablespoon of coconut oil. But it's the oil part that is the part that's heavily saturated. Palm oil, also very heavily saturated. These tropical oils are cheap. They put them in cookies, they put them all sorts of baked goods, all sorts of things, because they are cheap, but they are harmful for us as well. Pistachios, 1.2, filberts, 1.3, Brazil nuts, 1.5, but it's not till we get to almonds that we get greater than 2. Almonds, 2.2, pecans, 3, hickory nuts, 3.11, English walnuts, 6.9. And the best food to lower your cholesterol is a nut that's harder to find. Black walnuts, 10.3, but just a handful of these black walnuts can dramatically lower the cholesterol levels. So getting the saturated fat intake down is important. Another thing that we have found out in controlled studies that is important comes from this flower here. Does anyone know what? Yes, some of you recognize it. This is where we get saffron. Now, where is the saffron? What portion of this flower? It's those red stems. And saffron has actually been tried for Alzheimer's. And it actually worked as well as the leading drug in treating Alzheimer's, but without the side effects of these Alzheimer drugs. it seems to inhibit the amyloid beta protein development. This is the area that produces these tangles, these permanent tangles, and basically causes death of the neuronal cells in the hippocampus. Another thing that can lead to dementia is traumatic brain injury. Increased neuronal death from TBI can be prevented, however, by omega-3 fatty acids. This is, focus has been on the National Football League. Those players have much higher rates of developing dementia because of the head trauma that they experience as part of their sport. Boxers have a marked increased risk of developing dementia as a result of that as well. But what we have found out, it's due to the inflammation post-injury. But if we can decrease that inflammation, which omega-3 is a natural anti-inflammatory, we can actually mitigate against at least some of that increased risk. Omega-3 fats have also been found to increase BDNF levels. And I didn't go over this very carefully yesterday, so I'm going over it today. Almonds have omega-3. Spinach has even more omega-3. Green soybeans are loaded with omega-3. This is the edamame, where mature soybeans are not. They're going to be high in omega-6. Soybean oil from the green soybeans are going to be high in it. Wheat germ. This is why whole wheat is also good. Whole wheat has omega-3, and it's actually an anti-inflammatory substance. Black walnuts, higher in omega-3. English walnuts are higher yet in omega-3, so black walnuts are going to be better in lowering the cholesterol, but English walnuts in getting the omega-3. And then the two highest, chia seeds, are at the top of the list. 1 tablespoon, 7,289, and flaxseed, 1 tablespoon, 7,526. Sorry how the boldness came out forward. I copied this from another presentation, and it didn't copy the greatest, but I think you can see the results. So flaxseed is still up there at the top. This was a study done right here in Arizona by Beazle in the Phoenix area. And she showed in regards to depression, anxiety, and stress, when you switch to a plant-based diet, the average female had a depression, anxiety, stress score of 20, went down to 10 in 2 weeks. The male went from about 14 down to 7. So both of them halved their result, and you can see the p-value for those into statistics. This was a very statistically significant study. Why were vegetarians significantly less depressed, anxious, and stressed than even healthy meat eaters in the study? Negligible arachidonic acid intake may explain the favorable mood profile we observe with vegetarian diets. And so arachidonic acid is pro-inflammatory, and that also is going to be an issue as far as overall brain health. Where are the foods where we have the most arachidonic acids? These are the top 10, but you can see there in the top 5, chicken is the #1 source of arachidonic acid in America. Eggs are the #2 source, beef the #3 source, and then sausage, Frank's bacon, ribs, #4, and then fish is actually the #5 source of arachidonic acid, but it is present in all meats and eggs and fish. In Australia, it was a little different. Duck egg was #1 and chicken egg #2, and ox liver was up there in the top 5, and you can see kangaroo is on that list as well as emu for the Australians. The National Institute of Health sometimes comes out with confusing statements. But this was one of the statements they came forward. This is why sometimes when you go to a dementia doctor, and I'll just tell you a little brief story that happened. It was 2 months ago. I was actually asked to speak at the Mayo Clinic, and I was speaking. They had me speak in the daytime at a conference, continuing medical education conference, and then Friday evening, they had me speak at a fundraiser. It was me and one other speaker. And at the fundraiser, I sat across the room from Dr. Peterson, the table from Dr. Peterson. He was the one who was Ronald Reagan's doctor and Bush's doctor as they were suffering from dementia. He's the dementia expert at Mayo Clinic and all of those sorts of things. So we were talking about what we did with depression. He actually hadn't heard about digital dementia yet, so I was telling him about the studies on that and what the devices are doing and the accelerating decline of that. But we had a great time together, very intelligent physician. But sometimes when you go to physicians like this, now he is more into diet and lifestyle. He was interested in what we were going to say about it and wanting to learn about it. But sometimes when you go to these so-called experts, they'll come up with something like this. Diet and lifestyle interventions do not definitely prevent or treat Alzheimer's disease. Now, why do they say that with the mountain of evidence? Here's what they say. We need large, longitudinal, placebo-controlled randomized trials so that we can be certain, with that close to 100% degree certainty. Well, what the problem with that is, how can you do a large, longitudinal study with thousands of patients on both sides and have a placebo for a plant-based diet? They set themselves up. This is what the pharmaceutical industry does, because pharmaceuticals are easy to placebo control. And so since that's so easy to placebo control and we generate statistics and nice things from it, what they say is you don't have the degree of certainty that the pharmaceuticals have because you haven't done placebo-controlled trials, but they're setting up a false standard in something that can never be done, even though the evidence for it, apart from placebo-controlled trials, are very strong. So, a Journal of Alzheimer's Disease said this: a modest proposal for a longitudinal study for dementia prevention. It's time to realize that the ultimate study of lifestyle and cognitive health in aging simply what? Cannot be done. And so why raise this up as saying we can't be certain because you're not doing this when it's something that can never be done? What they do state is this: the absence of definitive evidence in this fashion should not restrict physicians from making reasonable recommendations based on the non-placebo controlled trials that are available. And this, of course, is very clear. And sometimes I have to remind people that some of these standards in medicine that we adopt today have never had a placebo-controlled trial behind it. I'll just tell you one of those, these hepatitis C drugs that are now shown to be quite effective in curing hepatitis C. Never did they do a placebo-controlled trial. But yet you're paying thousands of dollars a month for these drugs to help with hepatitis C when they didn't do this standard. Now, in a way, they didn't necessarily need to do the standard because over 90% cure rate in many of those variants of hepatitis C are high enough that to do a placebo-controlled trial may not be the most ethical thing to do. And I think it's gotten that way in regards to diet and lifestyle. Why should we randomize somebody who wants to exercise to be a couch potato to see what might happen to them? And of course, how can you do a placebo-controlled exercise plan, simulating exercise while being a couch potato? Again, it's one of those impossible things that they rise up in regards to that. And so if they don't do it for some drugs, why are they mandating it that it be done for other types of things? Now, one other aspect, and I notice we're about 5 minutes from closing time, but is something that I'd like to introduce that many people are not aware of, and that is the beneficial effects of caloric restriction and fasting appear to be mediated by the nervous system. Intermittent fasting results in increased production of BDNF. BDNF is that brain fertilizer that helps the brain, which increases the resistance of neurons in the brain to dysfunction and degeneration. Resting our guts periodically through daily fasting triggers a cascade of hormonal events in our bodies which boost our body's repair mechanisms. BDNF will go up with as little as a 12-hour fast, and will go up even significantly more with a 17-hour daily fast. Do you know what will also happen when this happens? When you're fasting for 12 hours, and particularly 17 hours, you will go into daily ketosis. And ketosis has been shown to be protective for the brain and can actually prevent some of these amyloid beta plaques. And so this is the advantage of what the medical community is now calling time-restricted feeding. Time-restricted feeding means we don't eat whenever we want to eat. We just eat at particular times and then fast after that. How can you do a 17-hour daily fast? Eat a good breakfast and a good lunch, and then nothing but water after that. And it actually protects the brain. It also helps the immune system. There's a study done on breast cancer showing that if you've had breast cancer and you change over to a 2-meal-a-day plan, breakfast and lunch, you'll have a marked decreased risk of ever having that breast cancer come back again because of that immune system. And we know if we start studying in other areas, we're going to see that as well. And so this plan that Ellen White talked about, that if it's possible for you to be able to maintain your weight or get to a healthy weight by going to a 2-meal-a-day program, could actually protect our brains a great deal from the later deterioration that can occur. If you fast for over 12 hours, metabolism of fat stores release fatty acids called ketones to be produced, which improve memory, improve learning, and reduce neurodegeneration. Now, I'll tell you, the world knows about these ketones, and what they'll tell you is get on a ketogenic diet. What is their ketogenic diet? That means it's a carbohydrate-deficient diet. No carbs, so you don't produce the ketones, lots of protein, lots of fat, and you'll go into ketosis, and you will have some benefits from that ketosis. Paleo diet and those type of diets try to emphasize this sort of thing. But the win-win situation, those diets are not sustainable because they're carbohydrate deficient. You're going to have problems getting tryptophan into the brain eventually. You're going to have some depression. You're going to have fatigue. So you'll have short-term benefits, long-term problems. But the plant-based ketogenic diet is simply this. It's a 2-meal-a-day plant-based diet, and you get all of the benefits of the healthy carbs, and you get the ketosis as well. And you don't have to go through these restrictive diets that will prevent you from getting even healthy carbohydrates. Prolonged daily fasting and overnight fasting reduce the risk of breast cancer recurrence. That was the study by the JAMA Oncology in 2016. And then I also wanted to mention the role of music. This was an interesting study that was initiated by medical students. Violin lessons strike a chord with Alzheimer's patients. Patients with Alzheimer's disease with otherwise limited cognitive function who had never before played the violin showed the potential not just to learn to play the instrument, but demonstrated improvements in mood and neuropsychiatric function in relation to the learning of the skill. For the study, William King divided a cohort of patients with Alzheimer's disease into 2 groups. A control group who received biweekly sessions of passive music therapy involving only listening to violin music, and an intervention group who received biweekly sessions of instructional violin lessons in addition to the passive music therapy. What they found out is the results indicated that even though you had advanced dementia, these patients in the intervention group were actually capable of learning the violin. Take them much longer, but they were capable of learning it. Those learning the violin demonstrated improved abilities in relation to everyday tasks, such as remembering names and faces. One patient recalled the name of a nurse she'd long forgotten. She'd had the same nurse for 10 years in this Alzheimer's nursing home, but could never remember the nurse's name. But after just 3 weeks of learning to play the violin, she greeted the nurse one morning by her name, shocking that nurse. The patients who received violin lessons showed observable improvements in mood, memory, and cognition. This is one of the reasons why we need to emphasize the healthiness of being lifelong learners. At a certain age, don't think, you know what, it's not going to help me at all to learn anymore. This is why it's good to learn new crafts or learn new ways of doing this or that, go to some nice instructional courses, continue to be educated throughout life, and if you've never learned to play the violin and you're 85, maybe now is the time to start. Then we'll have a case report. This was an 83-year-old female with progressive dementia since age 76. She had increased difficulty in getting dressed, cooking, and coordination of household tasks. She began to wander aimlessly around the house and then finally became incontinent of urine. Then apathy, anxiety, agitation, and irritability took place. You know, sometimes it's difficult to be able to help these individuals because with their memory loss and not realizing they have the memory loss, they want to go somewhere, you know, and they don't realize how much it would harm them. They wouldn't remember where they're at and those type of things. And so you almost have to talk in their language. Where are we going? Let's go here, there, that sort of thing to keep them from being agitated or irritable, because if you put them down in one place and they want to go somewhere, they're going to get upset at you. What was the intervention? It was pretty simple. It was the only intervention utilized, and that's why it was published in this medical journal. Turmeric, 764 milligrams a day. Turmeric is better than curcumin because it has a lot more antioxidants. The agitation and anxiety went away first, and then eventually she began to tell of her need to be able to urinate and was no longer losing urine. Then she began to laugh. She began to sing songs, and at 12 weeks, she began to knit as well, which she had long quit. And at the 1-year point, she began to recognize her family, which prior to that, she could not recognize. So dementia can be reversed to some extent, and all of her psychological symptoms resolved. She no longer had the apathy, the irritability, and those sorts of things. And that's a pretty simple thing. You can even buy the turmeric, grind it up yourself, or you can get it in capsules. I've noticed that in the medical world, in fact, Dr. Peterson was telling me this, since he's a big Alzheimer's researcher and he's so famous, all the drug companies come to him to try placebo-controlled drugs. And many of these drugs are designed to try to eliminate the plaques. But I've been mystified by this approach because in these plaques, the neurons are already dead. We can't bring neurons back to life. And I think it's similar to trying to resurrect the dead by bulldozing their tombstones off their burial site. We're not going to get any closer to resurrecting the dead by doing that. And the same thing in regards to getting rid of these plaques when the neurons are already dead. And so this is why we have to catch it in an early phase and do the interventions that can take place, like I told you about in this gentleman who is actually remembering quite well now and being on this approach where all these 14 things are in line and some of these other things are in line too. I'll close with this story of Malosi Sabande. It made me rethink aging. This was a couple of years ago. I was in Botswana. I was actually speaking to the members of parliament there in Botswana and the president of the country and the governor of the city. It was a VIP health expo that I was putting on in conjunction with the Botswana Union that were going through this. And when I got outside of the major city, they wanted to take me to one of their Botswana citizens who was farming out in rural Botswana. And I got to meet him. Jado Malosi, a Botswana farmer. He was 112 years of age at that time. And I met his daughter, who was 87. And he had this program, early to bed, early to rise. He was in bed every night by 8 p.m. And he would be up at 3 in the morning. Why would he get up so early? He would get up to cook for his work staff. He slept well every night. And at age 40, the Adventist health message had come to Botswana and he had become a vegetarian. He had also gone on a 2-meal-a-day program. His first meal was at 4 a.m. after he cooked, and his second meal was at 11 a.m. out there in the field. He would carry it out with him. And so he was fasting on a regular basis for over 60, 70 years. He was doing that 17-hour fast every day. And he worked 11 hours a day outside at age 112. His back was straight. He wasn't stooped over. He still had muscle tone. He was able to bend down. No tractors were being used. It was the old-fashioned farming. Physical labor was part of his daily routine. And he was still mentally sharp, no evidence of dementia at age 112. He would take one day off a week to not work, and it was Sabbath, and he taught his weekly Sabbath school class, and he was actually the Pathfinder leader of his local church. He's now 114, and here he is, the master guide, Jado Malosi. And, the Stanford Longevity Center, I've told them about, I'm not sure they're following up on him, but, this blew my mind, because I thought, if you can live productively till age 85, that's pretty good. But I realized if you're really living the New Start lifestyle, and he did, he had it all together, nutrition, exercise, the water, he was getting sunlight, that actual sunlight, which is better than vitamin D supplements by far. He lived a temperate, simple lifestyle. He got that sleep every night, that 2-meal-a-day program. When you put it all together, it's amazing what can happen when you live a life like that. So I call him Mr. New Start. He is my new hero, and he's one that can demonstrate that dementia does not have to occur when you age. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you that you have outlined through inspiration and science the ways that our brain can still be sharp, effective, and where we can have a powerful influence for you, no matter how old our bodies get. And we pray, Lord, that each one here might incorporate the information that can be incorporated, that they might have brains that are sharp and can be influencing others for the kingdom as long as life shall last. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.